Just what you meant to me. I never told you. Guess I couldn't see. Took it over granted. I never told you. Just took it over granted. I never told you. I never told you. Just what you meant to me. I never told you. Guess I couldn't see. You thought I'd notice the way that you had. Yeah, you thought I'd notice. Trying to impress. How you were really feeling. I didn't notice how you were really feeling. And you were by my side. I never told you just what you meant to me.
Okay. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. We're about to start our session. Apologize for the delay, but please join us and then sit a bit in the front to fill up the space a little bit. You're already in the very front, sir. Very good. We are still waiting for one more speaker, but I think we can just go ahead. So welcome to our session. My name is Windy. I'm a program officer at Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. I'm based in Jakarta, Indonesia, but our institute is based in Sweden. Welcome again to the Thai Pavilion, and then our session is exploring slow onset disasters and mobility risks from human rights perspective. So we are here with esteemed panelists, which I will introduce a bit later. As we converge now in the COP28 to address the pressing environmental challenges, our focus today shift from the immediate impacts of rapid onset disasters to the nuanced yet equally significant consequences of slow onset environmental changes. In the evolving discourse of these challenges, our attention has traditionally been drawn into the urgency of floods, landslides, and extreme weather events. However, the recent findings from our work in the region with the Chulalongkorn University in Thailand have illuminated the shadows cast upon the slow onset related mobility. The challenges in collecting data on this aspect not only hinders policymakers' ability to address the issue more comprehensively, but also underscore the need for a more inclusive bottom-up research approach. So today, we are embarking on a journey to comprehend these dynamics of slow onset mobility and migration risks, viewing them through the lens of human rights, which is anniversary of the 75th anniversary of UDHR is this year. So let's celebrate that. And the limitation in our understanding, as highlighted by our research with Chulalongkorn University, also call for a critical examination of the implication of these gradual shifts holds for human mobility. So the lack of consensus on how to define and understand environmental migration poses also significant implication for laws, policies, and responses on the ground. Adding complexity to this already very complex situation is the potential of maladaptation, particularly when large green development projects are implemented without proper consultation with local and indigenous communities, and which we have been hearing quite a bit in this COP and previous ones as well. In such cases, communities find themselves excluded from decision-making processes. So today's session aimed to synthesize these complex nature of our discussion, but also try to find a way how to move forward. So with us today here, we have now 3, but soon there will be 4. So Danang Nizar is a program officer of Raoul Wallenberg Institute based in Jakarta. He's focusing on human mobility and climate change. And then Ms. Pirawan Wongtini Sataporn, I hope I pronounced it correctly, is an indigenous Karen woman from Thailand and currently working as the Environment Program Officer for the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, or AIPP. Pirawan is working on integrating indigenous knowledge and the rise of environmental defenders into climate change and biodiversity frameworks. And Ms. Romchat here in the middle is the regional focal point on human rights, climate change, and the environment of the UN Human Rights Regional Office for Southeast Asia. So she's based in Bangkok. And our last one who is coming is Anjan Sundaram, is an award-winning author, journalist, and television presenters. Sundaram graduated from Yale University and holds PhD in journalism and literature from the University of East Anglia. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us. Our session today will be more of a discussion, and we're not using any PPTs, and we would like to also invite you to share your experience and your views in this thematic area. So today is the 5th day of COP, and we have been hearing a lot about this year is the hottest year in the history of mankind, and record breaking temperature in several areas in the world. Not the least is where we come from in Asia Pacific, and the impacts of people from our region but also elsewhere is increasing every day. And this climatic extremity becomes a catalyst of slow onset mobility. And so I would like to start with you, Danang, to provide us some insights into the intricacies of human mobility shaped by the gradual environmental changes, and how would you see ways to address these complexities, and which can then inform better policies. Welcome, Anjan. Hello.
Okay. Thank you very much, Wendy, for the great introduction and then the question as well. So I think, as we may all be aware, the interlinkages between climate change and human mobility has been gaining lots of recognition and then an increasing traction as well, both in terms of in academic realms, in the policy processes, as well as in the wider public narrative, and then in the popular media as well. And as we know, like for example, in this year's COP, finally we have a dedicated pavilion on climate mobility, which is next door. And then we could also see there are lots of and dozens of sessions that is focusing on the issue of climate-related mobility. But then I think while the immediate impact of the rapid onset disasters to human mobility is more apparent and visible, like for example, disaster-induced displacement, for example. But then I think we must also acknowledge the less apparent, but then equally important as well, the role of the slow onset environmental changes, like for example, drought or land subsidence or heat stress as well, as mentioned by Wendy, in shaping the human mobility patterns. And then, as we all know as well, that the implications of climate change extend beyond environmental concerns, because it poses direct threats to human rights, including rights to life, rights to food, to shelter, among others. But then despite this growing recognition within human rights literature and international law, but then based on RWI research, we observe that the connection, then the interlinkages between the environmental change, human mobility, and human rights remains insufficiently addressed. Like for example, we also observe this in Asia Pacific in general, as well as in Mekong regions, where governments are making tremendously important efforts in addressing climate change issues, but then often overlook the nuance of the slow onset climate-related mobility. And again, based on RWI research, we found that the definition and then the categorization of climate-related mobility itself, it still poses lots of challenges and complex issues. especially if we look into the national laws and then the regional policies as well, both in Mekong regions or in Southeast Asia in general. For example, there is still no consensus on what climate-related mobility really entails. And this issue is even more complicated when we try to see it in the context of slow onset related mobility. Because in rapid onset incidents, the causal linkages between the disaster or the incidents with the mobility is direct. It's a straightforward. Like for example, if you ask someone who are displaced because of flooding, for example, you could easily get information that they need to move because their house is inundated and inhabitable, for example. So the causal linkages is there. But then if we ask someone who were displaced because of drought or because of heat stress, for example, this causal linkages is not always there. Because then, especially in the slow onset environmental changes, especially, the impacts are gradual and then usually could only be observed over a long period of time. So in this slow onset environmental changes, the causal relationship and between the incident and then the decision to move is harder to calculate and to justify as well. And this gap will definitely impact the legal recognition, the human rights protection, as well as the access to crucial resources by the local communities. And then again, this unclear definition also impacts the limited ability of the governments to collect the data of this phenomenon. And without reliable data and justification, it is difficult for us to expect there will be a comprehensive and then an effective policy measures to address this issue. But then again, it is also important to note that this is not only an issue that is faced uniquely by Mekong regions, for example, or by Southeast Asian nations, for example, because even globally, there are still no standards or guidelines on data collection related to slow onset related mobility. Organizations like IOM and IDMC have tried to develop frameworks and tools as well to better collect and frame the issue of slow onset related mobility. But then these frameworks and tools are still predominantly by droughts cases, especially in African contexts. And I believe, especially when we talk about slow onset environment changes, it has very, very diverse and contextual characteristics. So it is very important for us to have a specific guidelines tailored to different hazards when we talk about slow onset disaster. And I think this is also resonates very well with the recommendation in the report of the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of IDPs, internally displaced persons, in the context of slow onset adverse impacts of the climate change, where it calls for an urgent need for all relevant actors to support governments to increase their capacity and capability in terms of the data collection and analysis, as well as the risk modeling. And then when it comes to effective policy formulations, I mean, coming back to your question, I think we also need to understand that the existing DRM, the disaster risk management, and then the disaster management cycles that become the backbone of the most all of the DRR policies around the globe, it was developed using the rapid onset disaster logic, which assumes there's a linear process of pre-disaster where we require preparedness, and then during the disaster, when disaster hits, when we need to mobilize the response, and then the post-disaster, where we need the recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. But then again, I think this framework is not sufficient and might not fit well enough to address the slow onset disaster and environmental change, because as I mentioned earlier, it is difficult to divide the slow onset environmental changes into a clear-cut phase, like pre, during, and post, especially because the impacts are perpetual and dissipate gradually. So I think this complex issue of data collection and policy-making processes is also affected by the fact that there is still a fragmentation of governance when we talk about slow onset-related mobility. But then it is also important to note that this is, I mean, the siloed approach is a common and then recurring issues every time we talk about climate change, human mobility, and human rights nexus. So it is very important, I think, to review the existing legislation and policies related to disaster risk management and disaster risk reduction as well, and other relevant elements like on social welfare, housing, or settlements as well, to really identify the gaps and suggest strategies to strengthen the protection of the people who are displaced by slow onset environmental changes, as well and other trends in climate mobility, and as well as to include and address the issue of the siloed approach on these complex policy issues, both at national and subnational level. I think I'll stop there, Wendy.
Just a follow-up, because earlier you mentioned that the unclear definition of this term is actually impact the legal recognition and protection for communities. So could you elaborate on potential strategies or interventions that you could think of that could be implemented to mitigate the impacts to affected communities?
But then I think before jumping into the mitigation and adaptation strategies, I think it is important to first highlight the disconnection. I mean, on top of the unclear definition, but also the disconnection between the local or situational understanding and then context and perception on slow onset environmental changes, so the local situation and perception with the scientific perspective when seeing the issue of slow onset environmental changes. Because based on our research, we observe that the local communities often associate individual events, for example, with climate change. Like, for example, when they encounter droughts or crop failure, for example. But then maybe the local communities, maybe sometimes they face more difficulties when we ask the long-term changes and for a future planning, for example. But then on the other hand, the scientific accounts, it's more focusing on the long-term trends and future scenarios, but then often also overlook the granularity and then the local specific context experienced by the local communities on the ground. So I think, and as we know in the development policy planning and processes, usually the scientific accounts, they have the privilege, right, compared to the local accounts. And I think it's also the case in the climate change and mobility context as well. So I think it is very important to call for a more balance between these two accounts in addressing especially the slow onset related mobility, because as I mentioned earlier, slow onset related mobility is highly contextual, highly perceptional. So I think it's very important to combine these two accounts. So, and then when it comes to mitigation strategies, from the research perspective, because RWI is a research institute, I think it is crucial to start by producing the actionable knowledge, and especially at the nexus of the mobility and climate change. Because as we know, there are many different types of knowledge, from scientific, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge as well, practical knowledge, and then there are also different means of producing of knowledge from top-down and bottom-up as well. So I think it is very important for us to use the transdisciplinary approach, because I think or we could also say as a co-production of knowledge, because I think that could be one of the most promising approach to produce this actionable knowledge. Because then research could include, for example, in practical terms, for example, by conducting local-led meetings, local-led research, for example, where people at the local communities could really try to conduct the research by themselves and for themselves as well. Since we're in the Thai Pavilion, I think it is worth to mention that in Thailand, I think we could use the Thaiban research approach, which is basically a locally led and then a community-based and collaborative research approach to really identify the issues as well as to perform and act as a form of a data collection processes as well. And outside researchers like us, I mean like RWI, we could assume the role as a facilitators. So we don't necessarily dictate what needs to be researched, but then it is still very important to have this role of facilitator, because sometimes, or maybe most of the time, it is not always that easy to connect the points, to connect the dots, right? So it is very important to have this facilitator role as well. So this could create a discussions, especially related to the local power relations and dynamics when it comes to the policy level, especially right from the design phase to the implementation processes as well. And this reliable documentation and archives as well, I think could help the communities to better prepare for the future shocks. So I think it is very important to have this actionable knowledge to have a very, very effective policy intervention in the future. But then I think the formula will always be pretty much the same when we talk about rapid onset and slow onset as well, because at the end of the day, what we need to do is to enhance the community's resilience in facing the future shocks, right? And resilience consists of multidimensional aspects from social, economical, political, and cultural, you name it. And because, like, for example, in one of the cases that we observe in Sri Lanka, because we also operate in South Asia, is that the government tried to introduce the livelihood diversification strategies in coastal communities to prepare the fisher folks so they don't need to necessarily migrate when their their income from the fishing activities is reduced or disturbed because of a changing weather patterns. But then it doesn't mean that the government discourage migration or discourage this type of mobility, because at the end of the day, migration and mobility is part of our human rights, right? But then at least this kind of intervention provides the communities with more options when they're trying to decide whether they need to move or to stay in responding to this external shocks. But then I think as a Human Rights Institute, RWI believe that a rights-based approach is the main entry point when we like to strengthen the agency and then creating the stronger protection that prevent the cyclical vulnerability. So in making any strategies, including in the context of the slow onset related mobility, it is very important that we have a clear assessment about what human rights are relevant, if and how they are being violated, as well as the exact part of the law that needs to be revised so it could protect, respect, and remedy the violations as well. But then I think it's also very important for us to remember that there also needs to be an evidence collected to inform the reforms, including the on-the-ground community experience, again, to include and incorporate the on-the-ground experience and then to have the nuance of the slow onset related mobility. Thanks, Wendy.
Very good, Danang. And building up on what Danang has been saying, drilling down so deep into the context, I want to actually ask you, Romchad, could you share examples of successful initiative or policies at the national or broader in Southeast Asia, the area that you work on, that effectively safeguarded the rights of vulnerable communities facing displacement due to environmental changes?
Thank you very much. So maybe I can start with the existing standard at the global level first, like how we can link and use this existing standard to protect human rights in the context of human mobility, especially on the slow onset event. Of course, we have the important global policies and initiatives that provide the state with the framework within the work to address climate change and migration. Of course, we already have the Sendai framework and the platform on disaster displacement that provide the policy guidance related to disaster. However, as Danang already mentioned, there is a lot of complexities in terms of the universal definition or legal definition on human mobility, displacement, refugee. We don't have the universally definition yet. That create a lot of issues and complications. And another difficulty, of course, the data collection and how we identify and distinguish the factors and the trigger that trigger people to move or decide to move. So it's between slow onset and sudden onset that trigger and encourage people to decide to move away from their communities. But one thing I haven't really seen people mention a lot, and we tend to forget about the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal, that climate action is part of that. But the 2030 SDG goals also mentioned and have the specific target for the state to, among other actions that relate to climate action, state need to facilitate orderly, safe, regular and responsible migration and mobility of people, including through the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies, which is in the target 10.7. And one existing policy that we cannot not mention is, of course, the GCM, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular migration, which is already grounded on the human rights law, which already affirms that states' commitment to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights of all migrants, regardless of status, which is really important. And in objective 2 of the GCM, state already commit to minimize the adverse drivers and structural factors that compel people to leave their country of origin, including on climate change. And another objective is the objective number 5 on enhancing the availabilities and flexibilities of pathway for regular migrations. State also commit to develop or build on existing practice for admission on and stay for migrants compelled to leave their country of origin owing to sudden onset natural disasters and other precarious situations, and they further commit to cooperate to identify, develop, and strengthen solutions for migrants compelled to leave their countries of origin owing to slow onset natural disaster and the adverse effect of climate change and environmental degradation. And of course, the existing international human rights law and standards, as well as other applicable international law, together with all of the policies and very critical to address human rights impact associated with climate change and relate to human mobilities. And one thing I would like to focus is our upcoming, it's already released, the recent report on the temporary labor migration, which you already mentioned about mitigation and the adaptation. And in Asia Pacific, the issue of temporary labor migration is the model of the migration that is most often officially recognized and promote, including increasing the adaptive response to climate change. But for UN Human Rights Office, we agree that from a human rights-based assessment of the temporary labor migration programs, which examines the migrants' full lived experience of temporary labor migration at and away from the workplace, as well as the consequence of these programs for their families and communities, it makes clear that these schemes, the temporary labor migration, are fundamentally unjust, extractive, and discriminatory, with the reality is that for many low-wage migrant workers, particularly those workers who live in the undervalued sector, the precarious and discriminatory condition of the temporary migrant labor program result in immediate and long-term negative human rights consequence. So that means we still need to have further study and more research to find the best initiative and policy guideline for the Mekong region, of course, especially in the Southeast Asia. So you ask, like, what is the successful? I cannot think of it immediately, but of course we are working on that, and of course Lau Wallenberg is leading this work on this research and OSHA as well. So yeah.
So definitely there's a lot more to be done, and this discussion should be the start of it. And I hope there will be more discussion about this issue because, as you mentioned earlier about the labor migration, 2 weeks before when we were in Malaysia, labor migration was also one of the things that we've discussed with colleagues from Migrant Forum in Asia, that especially from the health angle, that in the receiving and also host the home country, when they're back or moving, there are not enough safeguard for the labor migrants in terms of healthcare. When they move abroad, they will not have robust social protection in the host country, but also when they come home, they don't have enough support from the government themselves. So it is a very interesting area to look at, and then better protection should be provided to migrant workers, especially now there are a lot more coming out to find work abroad, and I think a better protection should be provided. So thank you, Danang and Romchat. Before I jump into the next part of our discussion with P and Anjan here, if there's any from our colleagues here, the participants that want to share your view about what was just discussed, by Danang and Romchat. Please, I can give one or two maybe. If not, we can just do it together at the end. Yeah, okay. So building on the insights from Danang and Romchat here, we now pivot our discussion to the next session where we are going to delve into the critical nexus between maladaptation and migration risks. The changing climate and the challenges highlighted by our previous speakers compel us to explore not only the risks associated with adaptation strategies, but also strategies to minimize migration risks in the face of evolving environmental challenges. In the last few years, and here at COP28, we have been discussing a lot about the shift from the fossil fuel to renewables, development of new energy sources, large-scale infrastructure as means of adapting and mitigating the impacts of climate change. However, we also see these instances where the measures that are actually exacerbating the vulnerability of communities on the ground. And I want to ask you, Anjan. We are going to move away from Asia now and then all the way to Mexico with Anjan here. In your coverage of indigenous environmental defenders in Mexico, Anjan, how have you observed instances of maladaptation, neglecting community rights, and potentially escalating the migration risks of these communities? Please, Anjan.
Thank you. And it's very interesting to hear about the impact of climate change on communities from our previous speakers. So my name is Anjan Sundaram. I'm a journalist. I work in Mexico and Latin America. And I'm mostly working with indigenous communities there who are trying to protect their mountains, rivers, and forests against pressures from private sector, from the government, and from organized crime, from cartels. And Mexico is currently, just to give a little bit of context, Mexico is the deadliest country in the world, along with Colombia and Brazil, for environmental defenders. It's also the deadliest country in the world for journalists. So these issues are very difficult and very dangerous to report on. And some of the communities that I'm traveling to and reporting on, they are essentially, they've been neglected by the government, and they are fighting cartels to protect their ecosystems, pristine ecosystems. And the pressures on their ecosystems have increased because of climate change, which has degraded soil quality, land quality across the rest of the country. And pressures on their ecosystems have also increased because there's a renewed demand for minerals to create renewable technologies to finance the low carbon transition. And many of these minerals are found in these indigenous territories. And so I've been traveling to these communities, and just to give an example, the last place I traveled to, it's on the Pacific coast of Mexico. The communities there are fighting a drone war. There's a European company, a mining company, which is kind of stunning because you think of the European Union as a leader in the climate space, with a lot of legal structures and penalties and implications for the companies. But the European company is trying to mine iron and gold in western Mexico. And the community said, no, we want to keep our forest on the mountain. We want to keep our jaguars. We don't want the mine. And there's a legal battle, but there's also, instead of just a legal battle, the cartels have begun to attack the community and try to open up the land for mining. And the community has now armed themselves with drones and anti-aircraft guns, and they're fighting back. And so this is how, if the mine has its way, the community will be displaced, and that land will become completely exploited for, to extract iron and gold. But the way that the community, in this case, is trying to defend its rights and defend its territory is through armed resistance. And some communities protest more peacefully through, blockades or protests on the street. But some communities have decided that armed resistance is the way to go. And they're putting their bodies on the line and their children against the cartels. And this is how, the land is being defended, or our environment is being defended one ecosystem at a time. So I think it's instructive to, it's instructive to know about these examples. Also, these stories are not told within Mexico or even internationally, because many of these communities are marginalized for many reasons. They're indigenous, so there's historical racism. They're very poor. Their interests are not represented in the media, and they're very remote. So it's actually very difficult to get to these places and to report on it. So I'll end there. It's just an example.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting that you mentioned about the critical mining industries, because that's also, again, what was discussed a lot in our region in Asia Pacific, because, for example, like a lot of the critical minerals are actually come from our country, for example, Indonesia, and so many other countries in the region. But then I cannot help but think that it's an evil circle, that you start with fossil fuel is an evil one, and then you go to renewables, maybe evil number 2, and then like you go around like that. Like, should there be a way for I know that there is no silver bullet in this issue, but then like, I just can't help to think that it's an evil circle that we have to break somehow, but I just don't know how. But maybe you have any insights on that maybe you want to share.
I think, this is a global issue. It's not just Mexico. We're talking about renewable energy. I was in Cambodia before Mexico, and in Cambodia in the north, there's near Stung Treng, there's the Sesan 2 dam, which is being built by China, or has been built by China. And the indigenous Bunong people there, they were also moved. And it's very similar dynamic. They have a traditional, very deep relationship with their land and their forests, and in Mexico as well. And I don't see it as a conflict between, just the mining company and the community. I see it as a conflict between two ways of seeing the world, two ways of life. There's the industrial capitalist way of life that sees extraction as a means for progress. And then there's, I don't know how to call it. In Mexico, you call it a more communal way of life that sees the ecosystem as part of the community, and the relationship is symbiotic. And there's just a different relationship with nature in both Mexico and Latin America, and in in northern Cambodia. And I think these communities, many of them, they're being pushed to the limit. They don't want to take up arms, but they're being forced to, because they see it as the only way to protect their way of life. The community in western Mexico that I went to, it's very interesting, because 500 years ago, Hernan Cortez, the first conqueror of the Aztec Empire, he mined that same mountain for gold, for his personal gold. And 500 years later, that same community is fighting against neo-colonial, neoliberal interests, mining companies now, trying to protect their way of life. So this fight has been going on for 500 years, and I find it very inspiring to be among these communities that, they don't just protect their land with words. They really put their bodies there, and they're giving everything that they have to defend what they believe is the right way to live in harmony with their environment.
Thank you so much, Anjan, for sharing your perspective from the Mexico and Cambodia a little bit. Now I actually want to go to Pirawan. So today is also the Gender Day of COP28. So drawing on your experience, how have you observed maladaptation, neglecting indigenous people's rights, in particular, indigenous women's rights, leading to potential escalation of migration risks? Please.
Thank you, and thank you so much for giving the space for indigenous person. And I'm very happy to be here, and also it's also happening in the Thai Pavilion. That is where I'm from. My name is Pirawan. That is the Thai name that giving my recognized by the Thai. But I also have my current name. This is Pokime. Pokime is the flower name that the flower commonly grow in the rotational farming, and that is the livelihood of the current people that doing the rotational farming. So maybe you can find more what is the rotational farming, that we do some documentation. So not showing like it's about the food, but how our life related to the nature. So before I start to the more adaptation, I want to start with, indigenous people, the way we looking the nature is a different lens from others. For us, nature provide us many sources for food, for life, but inside that, we don't see as a commodity. We not see it the value of selling, but we do. How do we take care of each other? How this thing can maintain to the future generation? And like when the new baby born, the father have to cut the bamboo and put the umbilical cord of the baby into that bamboo and tie with the healthy tree. And no one allowed to cut that tree because the soul and spirit of the baby is with the tree. So that is the knowledge, the belief, the customary practice that protecting the forest. And that's been be practiced for many generations, no? And that even the word of conservation starting, that is what we'll be doing. I come from Asia, where indigenous people, 2/3 of the world population live in Asia. But only 5 countries that recognize the term of indigenous people. And if come to Mekong, only 1 country that recognize the term of indigenous people. So just imagine if you are not visible, how can you be visible in the policy level? Even you are, as a person that not been recognized. One of my friends from the south, she said like, even the organism that called plankton, the scientists can see, but why other people don't see indigenous people? That really like giving the good reflection, like how you are not being visible, being seen, and you are left behind. And if you go back to the MDG, and also the current the biodiversity target, no, it's failed because there is lack of the participation, engagement. It's not inclusion. That's why it's happening. Something happening outside as well. To keep more, the session is lively. Just scroll down a bit, yeah. So when you are looking into the, before you go to the maladaptation, only your first step is already mistake when you not include everyone to the planning. So many of the national adaptation plan and also national for contribution NDC, these two also missing human rights perspective there. And imagine how even your indigenous people right will be visible. Even the basic human rights approach is not mentioning. Only few countries mentioning about the human rights-based approach, no, in the both NAP and NDC, and that is where it's missing. And how to say, indigenous people we living the way like to sustain and like make sure that everything is continue, but we contribute the less in the carbon emission or this climate change, but we are the one who most affected, and we dealing it every day in life. We cannot wait for this decision. Of course, I just started to follow climate change, but I feel like, why our government so slow? Our people who live in the ground, dying every day, migrating every day, and have to build our own resilience to deal with the climate change. Why it took 30 years to establish the loss and damage fund when we are already dying every day? And then the policy itself also not protecting and safeguarding us. Apart from the nature disaster, you also have another pressure from the law and policy that is not friendly to your way of life. It's always come from the top and down to us. And imagine indigenous people not speaking English, even sometimes not understand their own national language. How they can reach to this information? The right access to information already the gap there. And this technical language about climate change is confused me a lot when I first joined. And I not even know what are they talking about. And later on, I realized that this is my life, my people's life. We are dealing with it. But why we are not in that? Entering the room of negotiation just to observe. I cannot enter. I flew here so far. I also want to listen what are they talking about. Are they seeing us there or not? Do they know that we are existing here? Mostly I saw people took my picture or other indigenous people from region just to photo, recognize the beautiful culture, those things, and selling the culture to get the money, to get the tourists. But we are not part of that. We not get the money from that, you know. And the tax, we also pay tax, no? Indigenous people, we also pay tax because we have to also go to the market and other thing also use, starting use gasoline, that's one. Those tax also calculating there. And our representative, you also using the fund to come to negotiate from the tax from your country. So you should count everyone when you're talking about the policy. And it should be action oriented because those who affected most are living in the ground. Many plans is not reflected our issue. Sometimes they're talking about carbon credit. Then the private sector just plant the tree that is high value, that they can sell the carbon. But they not consider ecosystem. What type of tree should plant here? What type of the how plant that is make sustainable of the? Sometimes you plant and it die. Of course it die because they not belong here. How can they survive? Additionally, they may kill other plants also and bring other things. So we don't see things as the silo, no? For us, we see our life and everything connected to each other. We protect the land, and you will receive the clean water, the clean air. We're doing that at the ground. Our women are the majority people now living in the village. Because men and young people, they migrated and work in the city. So the women are become the front line defense of this land. I remember one of our current village. It's got fire and the hotspot come. Who come first? Is the people from the community go directly and stop the fire. And then we lost the life to protect those forest fires. Because of what? Budget to access is so difficult. And when you don't have the land right recognition, you can also not access to the bank or other thing like, you know, or to get the compensation because those things require the land title. But what about customary land title? It's not recognized. Even in ASEAN, we have the guideline on the customary land right that adopted, but still, few countries, I don't say few countries because it has not adopted, I mean it has not been implemented yet. But see, there are ways to improve the work. We have to create the space for dialogue and bringing the way of life and the knowledge of the people at the ground. The scientist is good, but it's also not the only option that we can tackle climate change. We also have the knowledge. We live with the nature, many generations, 1,000 generations, and we are alive and survive. So our knowledge, also scientists, because it through the time tested, it's not something popping in the air. We know what is the animal behavior change. We know how the weather is changed, and we try to live with that. So I think the more adaptation is started since the first step. How you ensure that the first step you start right, and that it will make your plan will go in the right direction. So make sure that our right is recognized and also see us as a partner, not beneficiary or vulnerable group. We have things to share, and that can help you as well. So we have to do the partnership. And the women role, please considering the indigenous women role. We have a lot to contribute, but there's just no space to giving to us. There is no resources to giving to us. They said we need capacity building, then give it to us. But not only one way, it should be two way. Everyone also have to understand who are indigenous people, what are their rights. We need to understand each other. We try to learn law and policy, but I think our state and other sector, they also have to learn what is the indigenous people want, what is our priority, what is our agenda. We are ready to work together, and that is we need the space that we can work together. So I end it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, P. And round of applause for Pirawan. Very passionate message that you convey earlier, and I think that the resounding message from the indigenous communities that come to COP is the same as you, and I hope everyone's listening and then can actually put in documents that we can always follow. And good that you actually mentioned earlier that even the human rights in general are not reflected enough in the NAPs and NDCs, because that's one of the research that we conduct at RWI, that is very limited, the human rights reference in national adaptation plans particularly. And then, so there are more works needs to be done in that front, and hopefully the post-GST's plans would be better integrating human rights and all of the communities that are and will be affected in the future if we don't do better next time around. So before I open for questions, I would like to hear from all of the panelists here. Now that we have learned about the challenges, what we've learned from different parts of the world now, I'd like to have you to provide a little bit of thoughts and insights about actionable points. Because you mentioned earlier that also, Pete, that now is the time to action. So what are the actionable points from your experience, or what can you envision to ensure that adaptation efforts are rights-based, considering the unintended consequences that may arise? We can start with Anjan first and then go from this side.
Thank you. Personally, I feel one of the, at least in my work as a reporter, I feel that the action that I'm trying to help, catalyze, is that there is increased visibility for these communities that are fighting and protecting pristine ecosystems, of which we have fewer and fewer in the world. As I mentioned, there are a number of structural and systemic factors that prevent just what we were discussing just now, just a dialogue, a partnership. Very often these communities are seen as beneficiaries or marginalized groups that need help. Even in Mexico or in Cambodia, when I speak about these groups, people in the cities will say, oh, they need education, they need schools. And I really think that if the rest of us have destroyed our ecosystems, and the striking statistic is that 80% of the biodiversity in the world is now being protected by 5% of the world's population that identifies as indigenous. So if the rest of us have destroyed our ecosystems, and these 5% of the world's population have protected theirs, maybe it's the opposite. Maybe we have something to learn. Maybe they know something that and practice something that we have forgotten, or we've lost in the rest of the world. And so I see it very much as a partnership, a potential for a partnership, and I see, at least in my work as a reporter, to be a sort of bridge between what is unfortunately two worlds, two ways of living, two ways of thinking, and to translate in some way through stories the experience of these communities for the rest of the world, so that there's an implicit recognition of the value of these communities, their knowledge, and value in partnering. And I think the ultimate goal needs to be to reevaluate and restructure this industrial model of development, because it's not sustainable. That's what's gotten us here, and we need to change that. So that would be my quick thought.
Okay, thank you. So I will start from my own level first, since I'm here. So I have to go back and share this to our brother and sister indigenous people in Asia. It's not just only limit to one country, but how do I simplify this negotiation and these languages for them to understand that this decision here, it will affect our life at the ground. That is the first point. Second point, we will continue to produce. I think as Danang said, indigenous lead or local lead research is really important. And that you will get the true, scenario, like is what really happening and how they can contribute. So the story is really sharing by them, and we just help to arrange, no? But here is the true story that they are doing at the action at the ground. The knowledge transferring is that what we're doing. Indigenous people continuing doing, because you not just only knowledge, but the value how you see the nature thing with life. It has to be kept so that you still sustain those natural resources for the future. And it's just not only indigenous people, it's for the world. Because we are doing that for 1,000 generations, right? It's not only in Asia, globally. And that's why Ajahn said 80% of the biodiversity still remain in the customary land of indigenous people. That is what the effort. And this, we have to transfer this value to the young generation as well. And then we need the recognition, the right of indigenous people. So I'm like selling the book. No, I'm not selling the book. But there are many knowledge. So here are the rotational farming. There are diverse of rice that not only rice, but more than 100 species that help them to get resilient, whether drought. We know what kind of seed that need less water. We know what kind of plant that can chase away the insect which harm to our crops. We don't use chemical for this system, but slowly the cash crop and monocrop is coming to our land. The farming system, the food system has changed. So those are destroying our land. The chemical are introducing to our land. And that is destroying our Mother Earth. The soil degradation is happening so faster comparing with the village that still continue their way of life. So we have to recognize the right of indigenous people and also promote the good practice of indigenous people, no? And that is what we are trying to do from our side. So what the state and the other sector can do, partnership with us. Let's open the space to talk, build the trust, because this work indigenous people cannot do alone, or every government can do alone. The COP is called for all people to work together. We have different responsibility, we have different contribution, and that is no time to waste anymore. Please work together. Thank you.
Thank you. From UN Human Rights Office, of course, we are here to advocate for the human rights-based approach, and you hear from Danang and Pilawan a lot about human rights-based approach. But I think the quick, immediate action that we need to do now is to include human rights-based approach in the text of Global Stocktake. I am not sure where it is now, but until yesterday evening, the draft negotiation text still don't have strong language enough on human rights. And Global Stocktake will guide the next update NDC. That is, I can think this is immediately we need to have more stronger language on human rights. And we always talk about the best scientific evidence to guide climate action. And this is already in the IPCC recent report, which I will read again. I talk about this everywhere, every panel about human rights approach. And I don't see in the negotiation that we are following, human rights still have limited space in the draft negotiation text. So IPCC reports already back up. We always said we don't have the scientific backup or evidence, but IPCC back up human rights-based approach, which I will quote, adaptation and mitigation action that prioritize equity, social justice, climate justice, right-based approach, and inclusivity lead to more sustainable outcomes reduce trade-offs, support transformative change, and advance climate resilient development. This is already in the IPCC, and it has to be included in the global stocktake to guide the next NDCs of all the parties. That is the most immediate action we need to have it now here in this COP. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure what I could contribute because you already have this very amazing answers here. But then I think in this COP at least, we have lots of sessions that talk about human rights and climate change. But then always then the next question would be how to do it, right? That's why, because everybody's agree that it is very important to include human rights lens into climate actions and strategies. But then the next step and then the next question would be how. So back in 2020, RWI, we developed what we call as a framework for integrating human rights and gender equality for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, or what we call as FIRE in short. So the idea behind this, the development of FIRE is that, as we know, there are tons and thousands of standards and guidelines on human rights that are relevant to climate change and disaster risk reduction. But then we also have to admit we don't have the time to read it all, right? So RWI, we're trying to consolidate all these relevant standards and guidelines into this framework, into this tool. So it would be easier for stakeholders, would it be government or non-state actors as well, if you'd like to practically incorporate human rights principles and gender principles, you could always use this framework. So this FIRE framework, it has 6 dimensions, which combines both the hard law human rights, like for example, the fundamental rights, non-discrimination as well, which I think beautifully mentioned by Pirawan, that for example, we need to have this meaningful participation from the indigenous groups, for example. And I think, I mean, as a research institute, even as a researcher, I think we also have the duty to make sure that this right to participation is included right at the beginning of the research process. So, because I think at the moment, the co-production of knowledge is the way to go. Because why it is important? Because then we expect that these research results are the one who will feed into the policy processes, right? So we need to make sure that since the beginning of the research development, we always include and incorporate the different types of groups, including the indigenous communities. So rights to participation, and then if I could refer to Anjan points as well on different worldview, because in this FIRE framework, we also have specific dimension on social norms and contexts, for example. We also have the agency and empowerment, for example, because it is very important to also include this different worldviews and different perceptions, although I know that practically it is difficult, because when we talk about policy process, it's all about the generalization, right? And then when we talk about social norms and context, it's very the granular and detailed aspect that we need to push forward. So it is not easy, but then at least if we already ask that important questions, if we already include those important considerations, hopefully it will be there. So FIRE framework was developed to help actors to ask the important questions that unfortunately sometimes it is overlooked. Because I know, I mean, policy makers, decision makers, they have lots of things that needs to be considered on their plate, right? And then we just don't want to include and add more homeworks to them without practically providing them with the tools what they need to do. So, but then it is also very important to know that we all have the responsibility to include this, to incorporate these principles and approach as well, the human rights-based approach. So with this FIRE framework, we're not asking all individuals to become human rights experts and human rights lawyers, because that is impossible. But at least please make yourself as a human rights practitioners, human rights advocates, because it is possible. So we'd like to offer this FIRE framework tool as something that could be used practically. You could use it to self-assess, as a self-assessment tool. So for example, if you'd like to self-assess your existing condition, for example, to see to what extent you have included and incorporate human rights and gender principles in your actions, in your strategies, you could use these 6 dimensions, for example. Or if you'd like to really consider this important principle and approach since the beginning, the ideation and the design stage of your actions or strategies, you could always use the 6 dimensions as well. So I think this FIRE framework is something that could be as one of the practical tools, because as I heard in one of the sessions 2 days ago, Mr. Surya Deva, the Special Rapporteur for the Rights to Development, he mentioned that the human rights, specifically the right to development, could actually become the entry point when we want to address the root cause of the climate change issues and the wide gap between the global commitment and then the implementation both at the national and subnational level. Why? Because as mentioned by Anjan earlier, I think one of the root cause is that the current economic model or regime is based on the exploitation model, the unjust exploitation model. And right to development could become one of the entry point to address that issue. And it's all included in the FIRE framework. And then, if you are interested, you could look it up in our RWI website, because there you could see all the dimensions and then the checklist as well that you could use as a self-assessment tool as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, all of our panelists, and thank you for pointing out earlier, Romchat, that the GST currently lacking the words of the reference to human rights. And so please, everyone, advocate for this. Talk to your constituents, talk to your negotiators in your own country to insert a stronger language on the GST document, and hopefully we will see a more rights-based document out of COP28. Now we have about 14 minutes or so for question and answer or reflection, storytelling from you or your experience on the ground. Please do. I can take 1 or 2 questions for now. Yes, one, sir, and another one. Can I have a mic? And the lady on the back, please.
I'm Faisal Parish from Global Environment Center in Malaysia, working with the ASEAN Secretariat on the regional program to address the issue of large-scale fires and transboundary haze, and very well aware in the northern ASEAN region, including Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and part of Vietnam, there's very serious issue of large-scale burning of agricultural residuals and land, and very often the blame is put on indigenous and local communities. From our work in many places, we know that that's not the right place to put the blame, and we see the very great expansion of the commodity crops like maize and so on encroaching into those areas. But from the perspective of the indigenous communities and the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, are there any initiatives or mechanism or other thing that is ongoing that we can somehow link with the ASEAN framework that we've developed, has been adopted by the ASEAN member states for investment framework to encourage resources to come, and we see very much indigenous and local communities as the key stewards of the land that need to be empowered and supported to manage, rather than previous approaches of top-down and control and blame. So it'd be very helpful to get your perspective on that and how maybe we could advance discussions. Thank you.
And please give it to the lady on your back. Yes.
Okay. My name is Kanika. I'm a Thai journalist. The major ongoing negotiation in this COP will be to decide either the fossil fuel will be phased out or phased down. And to me, I may be skeptical under this presidency. It's very likely to be phased down, just phased down. So my question is, do you see any scenario, either from your, especially indigenous people, under the, either phase out or phase down? That's one thing. And the other thing, another major negotiations on financial issue is that apart from the loss damage fund. Loss and damage fund will be a grant, but it is very small, you know. Now we have 700 million, which is a drop in the budget, in the ocean. But the other thing, the other financial support will come as a loan. So the developing countries will carry this burden, and with you cannot expect the soft loan anymore because it will come with something called insurance. So yeah, again, my question is, do you see any scenario? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for bringing up the issue of financial because it is a pledge, only a pledge, not. We're talking about loss and damage fund, but there's no fund. There's only pledge, and until there's actually money to implement something, then it's only a pledge. So maybe Peak, you can take the first question first, and then maybe and the second, I think it's also related to you, and then the others can. Anjan obviously can share your thoughts as well, please.
Yeah, I think in terms of the ASEAN level, we are so engaged with the policy development, and I think one of the things is the customary tenor that where AP also contribute. So I think in terms of information data that we can work on together and how to bring the good practices to influence, because our government want to see the good practice, no? We don't want to work like in the shame and name and shame, something like that, but how we build the collaboration and bringing the good practice or some kind of the plan that we can talk to. And then we also have the civil society that working together in the ASEAN level as well. So those engagement is ongoing, and also the documentation thing. So I think, yeah, we can build on that and to work together and see how can you enhance or complement each other. That would I say. And in terms of the fuel forcing out or something, well, my concern is two things, no? One thing, I'm doubtful that whether it really can, because most of our countries still rely on the cheap energy, right? And to transform to that, I'm not sure how it can be that fast. And I still see the ongoing, some of the project on the coal mining, that's still open, no? In our region is still open, and also it's transboundary. Maybe this country may not have in their country, but they do in other country. So this thing also still going on and happening. And I did not see in any policy yet, no, in our region to talk about this phasing out clearly. Of course, there is the plan for renewable energy, but renewable energy, if it's not with the full and participation of us, it can be false solution for energy, because the mineral that they use for the renewable energy, still it will be in the traditional land of indigenous people and also local community. And that if there is no safeguard protection, the environmental human rights defender situation still going on. It will keep increasing. Our indigenous people and local community, whoever are environmental, they will die to protect this land. It will be continued. It will not stop. And even those who talking about human rights, sometimes you may got slapped or stop not to talk about. When you talk about human rights, it's something very scary, you know, for a number of people. So how do we build like human rights is not scary. It's something like everyone should have. So I think we should not scare of that, because we want to ensure things is sustainable, not devastated, no? And the finance thing, less than 1% of the climate, I mean, let's say the finance climate also come to indigenous people, less than 1%. And that the future, the one that they are established, I also don't know if will come or not. And to access to that, there is no direct access fund for indigenous people and local community, no? So I also see no clue, like even either the grant or the loan, how you can access to that for indigenous people and for the grassroots level. It's so far, it's like a dream. And it's like you cannot imagine what is the single drop will come or not. And especially indigenous women, our women, to access to those funds, is even more difficult compared with other. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And maybe Romchat, you can give our insights from the negotiating team.
Not from the negotiation yet, but I want to respond to your question about air pollution, the transboundary haze in ASEAN, because coincidentally yesterday I joined the Thailand First National Conference on 2:5 p.m. where the National Human Rights Commission have their own initiative, which is really good, to find the solutions to address the issue of air pollution, especially 2.5, including from the perspective of transboundary and extraterritorial obligations. And the Thai National Human Rights Commission invite many stakeholders, including the authority, to discuss. And I can see from their presentation yesterday that they acknowledge that it's not indigenous people who caused the issue of transboundary haze, but it's also the issue of the business enterprise as well from the mineral crops. And that's why they want to bring the issue of business and human rights aspect to work on the complaint and the case that relate to the business enterprise across, or even Thai enterprise that have their operation in the neighboring countries and cause this. So I think this is a good initiative that the National Human Rights Commissions have looking from this perspective. From the question on phase out or phase out, I think from the UN point of view, we align with the Secretary General statement. He already declared it's very strong that he want to see the phase out of the coal, and I think we need to not be distracted by a new discourse, a new initiative. We have to address this issue, climate change, from the root cause, which is the fossil fuels. So from OSCHR, of course, we advocate for the human rights and environmental safeguard for the carbon market, especially carbon capture, storage, or removals. We want to see the stronger human rights and environmental safeguards from this new initiative. And the fund, of course, our position that we are advocating directly with the member states, the loss and damage fund needs to be predictable. Now, it is still the pledge, as you mentioned, it's the voluntary scheme. But how can we ensure what is the timeline who has to pay? And the issue of the CBDR has to be in place. So we have the clear timeline and the predictable fund that is at the global level that we are discussing here at COP, but back to the local level, we need to ensure, of course, that the fund should be in the form of the grant, not the loan, because if you create another burden for the developing and the least developing country, and the direct access fund through the indigenous people and local communities. And one thing that I joined another event that we cannot forget or ignore the issue of transparency and corruption when the funds come to the national level. Yeah, I agree.
Spot on.
Yeah, maybe I just want to add a bit of what Romchat has said, especially regarding the coal phase down or phase out. I think if we still remember when the oil was first discovered, it was recognized as a cleaner options compared to the coal burning, right? And now we're talking about renewable energies, but then there's also an issue of critical mining. So just like you said, I think we're in this vicious cycle. And the most important thing is that as long as we don't change our lens or change our behavior in seeing this issue, in seeing the energy, I think we're just going to be on this vicious cycle. There's always a possibility that in the future we're going to discover maybe new source, but then if we don't change our lens and we don't change our perspective, I think the issue is going to remain the same. Because, like for example, there's still lots of debate whether, like for example, geothermal, to what extent that it is sustainable, those kind of stuff. So I think it is very important. That's why human rights lens and gender lens come into place, because then by changing our lens, regardless of the future or potential issues that we may encounter in the future, that we could address it based on the human rights and gender principles and then the safeguarding of that. But then if we're still gonna do the business as usual in terms of the lens and then the way we see things, I think we're still gonna be in this vicious cycle. The same thing goes to the funding as well, because the loss and damage, the initial idea is that is a grant, but then it is also very important to understand that it is not an aid. Because if we're still gonna use the same lens of this is an ODA, then we're gonna end up in a, business as usual, project-based ODA. I'm not gonna say colonial, but then, it's gonna top down, and then those who have this fund will dictate what to do, and then it's gonna resonate as well with the right to participation, the one that we mentioned earlier. So I think this is why it is very important for us to change our lens, to change the way we see things into a more gender-based and a human rights-based approach. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. So I agree with everything that was said. I guess for me, the easy and maybe not politically easy, but the obvious solution is to transfer the money to these communities, to let them use them and act in the way that they see fit. And actually, it's right that you point out that they're only pledges, and it's not a lot of money, but many of these communities are used to working with not very much money. And I think even with the amount that's been pledged, we can see a lot of change if we were able to avoid thinking in this project paternalistic, colonial kind of top-down approach, and just hand the money and see what would you do with the money to regenerate nature and to protect the biodiversity that we all need and our children and next generations need. I think that as a concrete action, there are many studies about universal basic income and just providing direct cash as aid that are showing that strategy to be very effective. I think that you can transfer and apply those findings to the climate space, and I think we will see a lot of positive impact if we're willing to be brave enough.
Thank you so much. And is there anyone brave enough to ask the last question? No? Okay, because we're smack on the time now. And I'm not going to try to summarize all these very good points that our panelists have mentioned and discussed, but I just want to leave you with one note, and please, this is it. There's no turning back. There's no business as usual. We cannot afford to not do better this time around because this is about our life, our next generation life. Please put your best effort to safeguard human rights. Whatever the outcome of this COP would be, it has to be a rights-based one that benefits everyone and include everyone in the discussion and implementation and monitoring and evaluation, because we do want to prevent corruption, and transparency has to be protected. So thank you everyone for staying on, for coming to this session, and thank you for Thai Pavilion for giving us the space to have this discussion. Thank you so much. Bye.